Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. This is DHCD's Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program, How to Apply presentation. This is a program that is put forth by DHCD. We do have on the line today some of our housing innovations and energy efficiency staff, as well as ASNH staff here. We will be going through, in particular, preparing to apply for the fall 2022 application for affordable and special needs housing, or ASNH funds, but we will also be going over the program in general. So first, there are a few things that are different this round and this program year. The first thing that is different is particular to me. My name is Chloe Rote. I'm currently a program manager here at DHCD for the Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program. As some of you may have known who are returning applicants, our Associate Director of Housing and former program manager left over the winter. They were a little more fly by the seat of their pants, folks. I love an agenda. So we have an agenda here today. We will start with what is ASNH. We'll follow that with what is new in the program, what's the same, how to submit an application, a scoring overview, because this is a competitive ranked application, the notification process. So what happens after you submit an application? How are you notified of a funding decision? And then we will move into a question and answer session. Again, we will keep those to be relatively general. If you have a specific question about your project that is very particular to your project, we will recommend that you email a program administrator and set up like a technical assistance call to go over those. So what is ASNH? Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program is a program that is put forth by the Department of Housing and Community Development. It is for the funding for construction or renovation of affordable housing units. So it has to be funding towards developments. It is a single competitive application. That application will award up to 5 sources of funding. Those sources are federal and state funding sources. We hold 2 competitive application cycles each year. The upcoming deadline for fall 2022 is October the 31st. Our next application during this fiscal year will be in the spring. The tentative deadline for that is March the 31st, but additional information will be coming out about that likely in January. We will finalize the time that the application opens. When it closes, we'll hold another how to apply to give any particular details for that application cycle as well. So what is new for ASNH? If you have already logged into CAMS or reviewed any of the documentation there, then you have noticed that there have been some changes, mostly in documentation, not in the structure of the program. So the application narrative questions have been a bit reorganized. We've condensed some of them and reduced the total number of narrative questions that need a response. The application attachments have been combined into fewer total attachments. If you have logged in or read the application instructions, you've seen that there are now fewer templates provided. We've condensed some of the information on multiple documents into just one. We've given in the instructions document examples and explanations for each of those application attachments. The application instruction document itself has been reorganized. There's updated language that is more particular to the sources that are available now in ASNH, updated to more accurately reflect the way the program is run now. The same thing for the program guidelines. It's not necessarily new information, but it's been reorganized. The language has been updated. Both of those documents now have tables of contents that are linked in the PDF. So if you're reading through the table of contents, you can skip through to different sections. Again, predominantly the changes are just in the way the information is presented, not in the way the program is run. So what else is new? For the fall of 2022, we do have what is called the Affordable and Special Needs Housing, Housing Innovation and Energy Efficiency Supplemental Funding Round. If you are a returning applicant, you know that in the spring round that was due March of 2022, earlier this year, we were unable to offer high-E funds. The reason for that decision was simply that we knew that with the change in administration, the incoming administration was seeking to remove the state of Virginia from RGGI. What we've done for the fiscal year 2023, which encompasses our fall 22 and spring 23 rounds, we have added in this additional supplemental funding round. The eligibility for projects for the supplemental funding round is more limited than the typical fall application for ASNH, and we will discuss the typical fall application in just a moment. The minimum performance requirements for achieving high-E funding are the same. The total high-E cap is the same. So that $2 million or 10% of your total construction costs, that is still the cap. That is inclusive of other awards of high-E funds from previous rounds. So it's not more funding going into a project. It is not another competitive application. What the supplemental funding round is an opportunity for projects where all that they need to proceed to construction close or beginning construction is a high-E award. So that application is open now in CAMS. It will close on October the 14th, so it's a more limited time frame. And the application itself is more limited in scope. So we are not awarding any competitive funds through this application cycle. It is only for projects who have received all of the competitive funds that they need and are only seeking to achieve an award of high-E funds. So program guidelines are in CAMS for this supplemental funding round. I highly encourage folks to take a look at those. Essentially, what you need to take into consideration is, does this project have an award of a competitive source, Virginia Housing Trust Fund, National Housing Trust Fund, Home? Does the project already have the documents to show that it meets the minimum performance requirements for high-E? Can the existing gap be met with only high-E funds? So you shouldn't show a gap of more than $2 million. You can't need additional Virginia Housing Trust Fund, National Housing Trust Fund, Home funding. In addition, as laid out in the program guidelines, projects coming in for the supplemental funding round are not able to come in for the concurrent fall 2022 competitive round. So this opportunity is solely for projects that only have a gap that can be funded with the amount of high-E that they are eligible for. It's just sort of a makeup round for not being able for those projects particularly awarded in the spring to come in for this funding. So those are the things that are different for fall 2022. What's the same is most things, and we will go over each of these in the next few minutes. Applicant and project eligibility standards are the same. The funding sources, their limits and restrictions on those funding sources are the same. Submission is still made through CAMS. We will go through that process a little bit here. I highly encourage folks to go to the DHCD website, open up CAMS, click the user guide if you need additional assistance in going through the CAMS application process. The announcements and notifications of funding That process is the same, and the timeline for contracts is also the same. So applicant eligibility, who can come in for funding? Eligible applicant organizations are nonprofit organizations, for-profit housing developers, public housing authorities, and DHCD certified community development housing organizations, or CHODOs. Those eligible applicant organizations have to have an appropriate or eligible role in the project. Those roles are being the owner of the site or project, meaning that valid title or a long-term leasehold interest in the development site. The eligible applicant can be the developer of the project, meaning that you might not have a title to the site, but rather a contractual obligation to develop the project that's being applied for. You can be the sponsor, which is the owner or the partial owner agreeing to convey ownership of the project or the development to a second nonprofit at a predetermined time or at completion of development. For applications where the applicant is the sponsor of the project, that specifically requires a pre-application consultation with DHCD. That's a bit more complicated of a structure. We just like to make sure that all of our ducks are in a row, both from the applicant side and from the agency side, so that that application has an opportunity to be successful. The most important thing here is that an eligible applicant, meaning the organization submitting the application for the project in CAMS, cannot be the project LLC or the legal entity tied to the project. It has to be another organization. There are some further requirements for those eligible applicant organizations that meet one of the necessary roles. It needs to be the primary partner in the project. It must be the entity responsible for long-term operations or compliance of the project. It should be free of outstanding audit or compliance issues. And we recommend reviewing the DHCD audit policy. The audit policy is somewhat different from the way that financial documents are prepared for instance, for LIHTC projects and submitted to VHDA or Virginia Housing. That audit policy is linked in both the program guidelines that are on CAMS and will be uploaded to the DHCD website. If you search the DHCD website itself for audit policy, it brings up the same document that just goes over what is required both for an applicant organization to be approved in CAMS and also for ongoing compliance with our audit policy. Projects are eligible in the same ways that they have been previously. So for ASNH, there are two types of eligible projects. Those are rental or homebuyer projects. Projects cannot be both. They have to be one or the other. Those eligible projects must have a minimum of 5 units. This is more applicable for the home buyer side than for the rental side, but the minimum is 5 doors. Of those 5 doors, they do need to be targeted towards low-income households. This varies by source, but the requirement broadly for the program is less than 80% area median income is the income restriction. These projects can be new construction. They can be substantial renovations to existing affordable housing developments, or they can be adaptive reuse of buildings that were not formerly housing units. For all projects, they need to be under common ownership, management, and financing. The biggest point here is that if you have a 9-4 twin, those are independently financed, which means that they have to be separate applications to the Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program. When you submit your application, we do recommend that in the project description, you list that it's a 9-4 twin. You list the other application information with it, like the name of the project, but the actual application itself, meaning the underwriting, the description of the number of units, the number of bedrooms, all of that needs to be specific to the individual project. For particularly substantial renovations or adaptive reuse, there is a minimum investment of $15,000 a unit. I will say this figure has not been updated in some time, so that feels a little bit low to me now, but the real requirement is 3 or more major systems. So if you are taking over ownership of a building that is affordable housing that otherwise meets our standards, but all you're doing is painting and maybe replacing windows, a couple of appliances in select units, that is not going to meet our minimum investment threshold, and it's not going to meet the requirement for 3 or more major systems to be updated. The real spirit behind that guideline is that for most of our sources, while you are in your affordability period, there's no additional DHCD investment that is allowed. So what that means is that when we evaluate a rehabilitation project or a renovation project, what the panel is looking for is this a substantial enough renovation that for the next 30 years, there will not need to be an additional investment of home funds, for example. That is really I would lean more on the major systems being replaced than the minimum investment, because again, that dollar figure has not been updated in a number of years. And just pricing out like flooring or windows, a couple of things for individual units, you could easily surpass that investment mark, but still not touch the necessary system. So that's a both and criteria, not an either or. Within our projects, generally speaking, we are funding projects that are 1, 2, or 3 bedroom rentals. They're single family homes. Scattered site and SROs are allowable, but with those project structures, we recommend consulting with DHCD, having a technical assistance call prior to completing an application, just to make sure that you are meeting all of the necessary requirements in terms of available amenities, that common ownership, management, and financing structure. Those are allowable, and we have awarded projects that meet those unit types, but they do sometimes require some additional back and forth with agency staff. The same is true of group homes. If you're reading the program guidelines, there are some special allowances for smaller developments or for group homes. But for those applications in particular, a DHCD consult or technical assistance call is required prior to submitting an application. Also the same are our funding sources, with the exception of adding back in high-E funds. So for fiscal year 2023, which again is the fall 2022 competitive application, the spring 2023 competitive application, and particularly for high-E, also that supplemental round being held in the fall, we have approximately $160 million that we have available to allocate. These are approximate allocations. What that means is that as we move through the program year, it is possible that funds from any given source will be reallocated internally from DHCD programs into or out of affordable and special needs housing. Generally, that means that there is an increase in the available funds. Historically, that's been the case. The other important note here is that if funds are not awarded out of the fiscal year 2023 applications, DHCD does have the ability and reserves the right to roll funds forward into future application cycles. So these numbers are quite a bit higher than we saw last year, almost double what we were able to allocate last year for FY22, we were closer to $80 million total over the course of the entire fiscal year. For FY20 and 21, we were at less than $80 million for both of those combined. So there's a considerable upswing in the amount of funding that we have available to allocate. We're very excited about that. There's definitely a need, and it has been exciting to see both at the federal level and at the state level, the General Assembly agree that housing is worth a significant investment. However, if there are not enough projects that come in that are ready to begin construction in an appropriate amount of time, that are well structured to be successful over the course of the development timeline and the affordability period, DHCD will roll these funds forward and not necessarily allocate all of the funds available to us in this fiscal year. The project funding limits are the same as well. So this is a little bit tricky. It does not lend itself well to a PowerPoint slide. There is both a narrative explanation and more accessible, I feel, charts in the program guidelines document, and I would recommend referring to those as you move through preparing your application. So the maximum request per source for a project is $700,000. That is the maximum amount of home, National Housing Trust Fund, or Virginia Housing Trust Fund that a project can apply for. There is a maximum request per source that bumps up to $200,000 more if the project provides eligible permanent supportive housing units, which we will define and talk through the requirements of in just a few moments. That is for only 2 of the 3 sources. So the maximum increase is $400,000 that is spread among 2 of the sources for projects providing permanent supportive housing units. For a project that has home and National Housing Trust Fund and Virginia Housing Trust Fund, that means that the maximum request is $2.1 million. That maximum request is per project, which means it is inclusive of any previous DHCD awards to the project. For a project with permanent supportive housing units, that bumps up to $2.4 million, again, inclusive of previous awards, and I would refer to the program guidelines for additional information on that. The Housing Innovations and Energy Efficiency funding source has its own maximum funding limit. For a project which receives a score high enough to receive a competitive award, meaning the project is scored out, it ranks high enough to receive home, National Housing Trust Fund, or Virginia Housing Trust Fund dollars, and the project demonstrates that it meets the minimum energy efficiency performance requirements of the HIE program. An additional $2 million can be awarded to the project. That $2 million is a maximum of 10% of the total construction costs, which means either 10% of the total construction costs or $2 million, whichever is lower. That is a lot of words to describe a process. What I can tell you is that in the program guidelines, we do walk through this in more detail. Additionally, when you are applying, our rental underwriting template is now inside of the application workbook. Both the rental and the homeowner underwriting templates inside of that application workbook will calculate the maximum HIE award for a project. So if you have any concerns, I would fill out that underwriting information and feel free to give myself or the ASNH or HIE team a call, and we're happy to provide technical assistance on determining the maximum award. That means that stacked, the maximum amount of Home National Housing Trust Fund and Virginia Housing Trust Fund on a project that demonstrates eligibility for HIE funds could be $4.1 or $4.4 million. Again, please refer to the program guidelines. Feel free to give us a call for technical assistance on determining the maximum amount of funding that the project is eligible for. Income targeting for assisted units is the same as well. These income targets are determined by a project source, and they can be stacked, which means if you have a project that has an award of National Housing Trust Fund dollars and an award of Home Investment Partnership dollars, there is an expectation and a requirement that that project provides a certain number of units that are at or below 30% AMI, and also a certain amount of units that are at or below 60% AMI. This is more fully spelled out in the program guidelines, but broadly speaking, homebuyer projects are required to be restricted in availability to households with incomes at or below 80% of the area median income where the project is being developed. And state sources for rental projects, state sources meaning Virginia Housing Trust Fund or Housing Innovations and Energy Efficiency, are required to be at or below 80% AMI. Units for Home or National Housing Trust Fund are that 60 or 30% AMI or below. The period of affordability is also remaining the same. For all rental projects, the period of affordability is 30 years. The one exception to that is home funding, which is still 30 years, but because of the structure of that federal source, there is a federal compliance period and also a state affordability period that is mandated in the contract. So as you review a program agreement for home funding, you will see the breakout of, for new construction, a 20-year federal compliance period and an additional 10-year state affordability period. For renovation projects, that's 15 and 15 years, but the total affordability period for rental projects is 30 years. For homebuyer projects, that is determined on an investment by unit basis, which means for a homebuyer project that has multiple units that have different levels of investment in the unit of DHCD funding, different units could have different affordability periods. That process of determining what the affordability period is for a homebuyer project is spelled out in the program guidelines, and we are happy to have an additional technical assistance call to talk through that in more detail for the project. For homebuyer projects in particular, we have recently brought on a program manager specific to single-family home developments under ASNH. Her name is Dawn Scott. If you worked through the Home Down Payment Assistance Program at DHCD, her name is very familiar to you. She is in the process of transitioning out of the DPA program and into fully running the Affordable and Special Needs Housing single-family home buyer program. So I'm happy to set up a meet and greet call if you are already an applicant. Over the course of October and November, we will be setting up introductory calls if you haven't already met her, as she takes the handoff for all of those projects. The typical type of assistance is remaining consistent as well. For rental projects, all funding is structured as low interest deferred principal permanent loans. What that means is that The principal payment is deferred for the life of the affordability of the loan. The low interest typically for ASNH projects is 3%. If you require a deviation from 3%, there is a space towards the end of the narrative questions where you can detail the reasons for that deviation. Those interest payments are required over the full affordability period, so you should expect to have some debt service on this funding. For high E, those funds are provided in the same structure. So if you have received a previous affordable and special needs housing award, the program agreement and the loan commitment form, the closing process with Virginia Housing or VHDA for our loans remains the same. For high E, however, that interest rate is set at 0%. Our funding cannot be structured as a cash flow only loan. We do not do construction disbursements. Funds that are awarded to a project are available at permanent conversion only, and that is generally secured in second position with a restrictive covenant deed of trust recorded for each source of funding awarded to a project. For homebuyer projects, it's set up a little bit differently. The funding award is secured by a grant agreement or a deferred loan agreement. Construction reimbursement draws are made at 4 predetermined milestones in a project. That original funding award is secured by a deed of trust that is issued to the applicant by DHCD and names each property or parcel tax ID number that is covered under the award. As a unit is completed and sold to a buyer, we release a portion of that main deed of trust and secure a second deed of trust, second promissory note to the buyer themselves. And that is how we secure the full length of the affordability period that accompanies the restrictions on primary residence, et cetera. Additional program requirements remain the same. These are detailed in the program guidelines, but they include home entitlement and CHODO policies, high E performance requirements, permanent supportive housing unit determination, Section 504 units, any additional requirements or regulations set forth by each funding source. We will talk through the home entitlements, the high E performance requirements, PSH units, and Section 504 in just a moment. For the home source in particular, there are 3 sort of quirks to home. The first is that there are a set of localities in Virginia that are called entitlement or consortium areas. These are listed in the program guidelines at Appendix A. These entitlement or consortium areas or localities receive directly from HUD their own allocation of home or CDBG funding. For projects that are located in entitlement or consortium areas, they're still eligible for funding from any source from ASNH, but particular to home, there is a requirement for local match. And what this means is that if a project that is located in an entitlement area, for instance, the city of Richmond, and it is requesting $400,000 of DHCD's state home funding, then in order to be eligible for state home funding, that project has to demonstrate that it has a committed match of 25% local funds. So for a $400,000 state home request, we would need to see submitted with that application a committed $100,000 local match. That local match can be through locally controlled and awarded home funds, but there are some additional sources of local matches that are allowed. In our more rural areas, we will sometimes have a waiver of sewer or tap fees as long as it amounts to 25% of the home request at the state level and is locally controlled. That is allowable. There's a list of some additional eligible matches in the program guidelines. If you have any questions about what your match could or could not be, what your existing capital stack looks like, what is eligible to be considered your match, please let us know. Any DHCD staff member under the ASNH or HIE team would be able to direct you to that information. Also under home, a project in a non-entitled or non-consortium area for the home scoring receives an additional 5 points. That is a points preference that helps us to meet our requirement for the way that we distribute funds that are the state level home funds. There is an additional scoring preference of 5 points on the home application only if there is CHODO involvement in the project. Additional home requirements include the Part 58 environmental review process. The Part 58 process, the form is something that most folks are familiar with. The template is available both on the DHCD website and on the HUD Exchange site. The sort of quirk there is that public notice is required. What that means is that prior to performing any development activities or choice limiting activities, a project receiving home funds has to submit to DHCD the Part 58 template required by the type of project. DHCD staff have to perform an environmental record review. We are required to publish a public notice, including a comment period, giving the public information about whether or not there were any findings of significance in the development of the project, the proposed amount of state funding going into the project, as well as the total development costs. DHCD has to allow for a public comment period. We then have to forward to HUD that documentation, and HUD has their own public comment period that has to elapse. So for home, there's these additional things that we have to take into consideration, both in scoring and also in after the award is made, what requirements need to be completed prior to executing a purchase and sale agreement, starting any kind of construction activities on the site. So there are some additional requirements. These again are detailed in the program guidelines with a little bit more information there. For those CHODOs, or community housing development organizations, particular to the home funding source, these are organizations that meet certain organizational and mission requirements as dictated by HUD. There are 2 documents that are really helpful. They are linked in our program guidelines. That is the CHODO self-certification checklist and the CHODO survivors guide. That is a HUD name. It is not our name. I think that it's really terrible because it's not a difficult process necessarily if your organization already meets the mission requirements and the organizational requirements of becoming a CHODO. But CHODO Survivors Guide is some great information. It's a publication directly from HUD. For CHODOs, there is one big difference that has taken place over the last 12 to 18 months, and that is that DHCD certification is done through an independent CAMS CHODO certification application. 3 or 4 years ago, you were able to upload the relevant documents into the reports tab of a project or into your organizational information in CAMS. We require now that all CHODOs, if they are seeking DHCD certification, to be eligible for the scoring preference on home applications, that they complete the CHODO certification application that's available in PIMS. Those CHODO requirements have to be continually met throughout the involvement of the CHODO in the project, which means that an annual recertification is required in PIMS. For our existing DHCD certified CHODOs, the earliest that you would need to recertify would be after the fall 2022 application cycle. So if you have any questions about that process, or if your application approval letter says something other than fall 2022, please reach out to myself or to Carly Blake, and we would be happy to edit that as necessary. But that recertification would not be required until December 2022 or January 2023 at the earliest. Just from a capacity standpoint, we know that you are working on a fall 2022 application. We will be working on scoring the fall 2022 applications. And so we will begin recertification for previously approved through the CHODO certification application organizations in the winter. Also the same, high E performance requirements. This is listed in the program guidelines and also again under Appendix B in those guidelines. New construction, substantial rehabilitation, and adaptive reuse have some differences in performance requirements. Consistent across all project types is a green building certification that is required. In the program guidelines, there is additional information about which green building certifications or which levels of certifications for the certifications that have multiple levels create a project that is eligible for high E and meeting those performance requirements. Additionally, for new construction, those requirements include being Zero Energy Ready Homes certified. For substantial rehabilitation, an average HERS index of 70 or below across all units, or a 40% improvement in the HERS index, as indicated by the plan review and HERS rater certification, is required. For adaptive reuse, so creating housing out of a non-housing building, the average HERS index needs to be 80 or below across all units. There are some additional stipulations and requirements that are detailed both in the slide notes, as you will see when we post the slides and recording to the DHCD website, and they're also stipulated in Appendix D of the program guidelines. For permanent supportive housing, this is both a points category for the need section of scoring for rental projects, and also a general effort across the Commonwealth. Here we have listed out, and on the following slide, we give more information about permanent supportive housing specific to affordable and special needs housing applications. Within the Commonwealth of Virginia, broadly speaking, permanent supportive housing is an effort that seeks to increase the access that certain Virginians have to additional choices for integrated community-based housing. These are for Virginians with special housing needs, which include from the DOJ settlement, IDDD populations, the serious mental illness population, and then chronically homeless or HUD homeless populations are specifically called out in Virginia. So for affordable and special needs housing, there are some additional requirements for getting the increased request limit for funding awards and the scoring preference of 5 points in the need category. These are detailed again in more, we go into more detail in the program guidelines. There is, according to development size, a minimum number or percentage of units that have to be set aside or covered under the MOU for PSH in order to receive the scoring preference and increased funding availability. An MOU with a referring agency is required. Generally speaking, this is to help developers ensure that their units are utilized well. Often referring agencies will be members of the COC or a CSB. They will be agencies which can provide additional rental assistance. They may or may not be able to connect the folks placed into these units with additional service opportunities. The compliance here is not identical to Virginia Housing's LIHTC process. So our program guidelines and our program agreements will stipulate that if there is not an immediate referral for one of these units from the MOU agency, a 60-day listing is required on the Virginia Housing Search. So Virginia LIHTC is run as a different process. Generally, what you have is an agreement with DBHDS and a much quicker unit turnaround time. So that's just something to be aware of, that we are looking for references to this, and we will be looking for compliance with this as well. Section 504 accessibility is one of many of the federal regulations that are imposed on ASNH funded projects, but this one in particular I like to call out because it does have to do with the way that the physical building is constructed and designed. So for rental projects, new construction or substantial alterations as defined by the Section 504 language, 5% of total units in the development with a minimum of 1 unit have to be constructed in such a way as to be accessible to individuals with mobility impairments. 2% of total units in the development with a minimum of 1 must be constructed in such a way as they are accessible to those with sensory impairments, which could be vision or hearing impairments. For projects which are renovations that do not meet the substantial alteration definition of Section 504, those other alterations do require accessibility to the maximum extent feasible. Section 504 is very clear that this may not require the full 5%, 2% accessibility metrics, but this can affect the project's score, particularly if we have many projects which are new construction or substantial rehabilitations or substantial alterations that meet and exceed these guidelines. So if you have a project where the age and structure of the project is such that it does not fall under the substantial alterations category, but rather under other alterations, we recommend that you reach out to DHCD prior to submitting an application, just to have sort of a level set conversation about what accessibility measures are being made and how that is to the maximum extent feasible, so that we can be aware of that and guide you in how best to answer the relevant questions and have the relevant attachments in the application for the best possible scoring of that application. Again, additional regulations. We do award both federal and state funding sources, 5 of them in total, which means there are many additional regulations that may or may not apply to your project. These are detailed in the program guidelines, but include things like compliance with the Fair Housing Act, Lead Safe Housing Practices, the Uniform Relocation Act, Section 3, labor standards, Davis-Bacon regulations, additionally things like eligible costs, maximum amount of subsidy per unit, rent limits, increases to rent limits, lease requirements, and so forth. These are all stipulated in the program guidelines. And if you have a question about how one of these applies to a project that you are submitting for funding, please let us know. We're happy to talk through each of these with you. Application submission is by the deadline of October the 31st, 2022. If you have worked in CAMS previously, you know the application will automatically close as the time changes from 11:59 p.m. on October the 31st to midnight on November the 1st. However, DHCD technical assistance, including answering of the CAMS help desk email, is limited to regular business hours. So you are welcome to burn the midnight oil and submit your application October the 31st at 10:57 p.m. No one on my team will be here to answer any questions that you have at that time. So we recommend that you plan accordingly to submit an application within business hours, particularly that last day. Generally speaking, the team is pretty available to answer phone calls or answer emails about any issues that are occurring with CAMS. If they are technical issues within CAMS, that is something that we may or may not be able to resolve in a limited amount of time. So for folks who are newer to using CAMS, we recommend planning to submit your application a few days earlier than this, just because if there is additional technical assistance outside of what can be provided relative to program requirements by the ASNH staff, that can take some additional time to sort of rally the resources. An eligible application has to be submitted in CAMS. It has to be under an eligible applicant entity. Please use the application instructions that will walk you through required materials, required responses for narrative questions. After the application closes, November the 1st, bright and early, we put together a document that lists out all of the applications that have come in. Scoring is done by a panel review of DHCD staff. The first thing that we do is review all submitted applications for eligibility. So is this project eligible? Is the applicant eligible? Is this an LLC that's registered in CAMS? Does it name a particular project, or does it have a general development idea behind it? We've had a couple of applications that didn't meet Section 504 requirements or didn't name a particular development site, but rather were just general requests for funding. So the project has to be eligible. The application has to be eligible. It has to be complete to be scored. If an application meets that baseline of eligibility, that general review, then the panel will review, score, and rank each project. The funding threshold is 60 points out of a 100-point score. However, a score of 60 points only makes a project eligible for funding. It does not guarantee funding. In past rounds, we have had, for instance, a minimum awarded home score of like 80 points, a minimum awarded Virginia or National Housing Trust Fund score of 75 or 78 points. So once we have completed scoring, we rank projects in score from high to low. We start at the top and we work our way down. And there's no guarantee that a project that scores at 60 or 62 or 65 points is ranked high enough relative to other applicants to achieve an award of funding. That being said, how do we score? The scoring is done, like I said, from 0 to 100 points. 40 of those points are the need that the project is filling. So the applicant will demonstrate through narrative responses and information and attachments that the project fills a critical need in the market area. For those attachments, there is explicit language around what we are looking for, what is required, what are optional but nice to have documents that you can upload. For rental projects only, permanent supportive housing projects with eligible units that meet those stipulations previously noted, receive 5 points in this category. And for home funds only, projects that are located in non-entitlement or non-consortium localities receive 5 points. This is something that has come up a handful of times. We are working on formatting this score sheet so that it's more obvious, but essentially what this means for this home funds only is that in the need category for housing trust fund, either federal or state, the minimum score in the need category for those trust fund scores, the minimum score is 5 points. For home funds, the minimum score is 0 points. And the first 5 points are awarded to projects that are located in non-entitlement or non-consortium localities, which means if you receive a score or if you look at past documentation of awards, there is a difference between the minimum score of home that receives a funding award and the minimum housing trust fund score that receives an award. And that is because the home program in particular requires these two separate funding scores for non-entitlement and non-consortiums. And then again, later we will discuss the CHOTO score. For feasibility, the applicant demonstrates through narrative responses and information and attachments that the project is likely to come to a timely completion. This we look at a few different ways. The first is that each source that we award has its own restrictions on us at DHCD in terms of the amount of time that we have to complete a program agreement, fully committing the funds, including all of the required pre-contract information like that home environmental review. Each source also has a requirement for when DHCD spends out the money, which we cannot do until you complete the project. So we will score on project readiness and feasibility as demonstrated through your application through things like timeline, zoning certification. If you have other projects that are awarded ASNH funding in particular, and they have been delayed to any extent from the original timeline that was submitted with the funded application, I would advise that you talk through the reasons for those timelines being inaccurate and delayed and how those will not affect this timeline, or the reasons that this timeline being submitted is accurate to the actual on-the-ground process of the project. Also, the last capacity or the last scoring is developer capacity. 30 points comes from here. For home funds only, CHOTO involved project received 5 points. So again, your minimum home score is 0 points. For housing trust fund, you get an automatic 5 points as the minimum score of that 30-point total. Developer capacity is something where the applicant has to demonstrate to DHCD that the development team has the ability to successfully complete development projects, deliver affordable housing, and also continually manage that housing through the property management team. So things like filling in the past participation in the application workbook. To an extent, for federal sources, this is a requirement where HUD could at any point ask DHCD to talk through how we evaluated developer capacity for any awarded project. In addition to that, as an agency, we are required to evaluate the capacity of relevant partners. So if there are additional partners beyond the applicant, some of our projects come through. The applicant is the same organization that will be doing the literal development, the building of the project, as well as ongoing property management. If you have additional partners in your project who are doing the development, securing that construction contract or loan, a separate property management entity that you will bring in at completion for a lease up, et cetera, we would like to see information on the capacity of each of those partners so that we can certify that each of those key partners in a project has the ability to do their share of the work that's required to bring the project on board. After the panel reviews and scores for each of our competitive sources, which is Home, National Housing Trust Fund, Virginia Housing Trust Fund, and the State Permanent Supportive Housing Fund, then any project requesting high E funds will be judged according to the documents that are submitted with that high E funding application. This will include things like reviewing the Green Build certification, documentation, reviewing the HERS plan review or preliminary certifications, any kind of preliminary materials showing that the project will meet the Green Build requirements and the Zero Energy Ready Homes or HERS rating requirements. There is also a narrative portion of the application where if a project is a substantial renovation or an adaptive reuse project, and there are some additional steps that are needed to meet each of those requirements, you have an opportunity to talk through, sort of in a free text space, what steps are being taken or what processes are being followed to ensure that the project will meet each of those stipulations. Again, a project has to receive a score that achieves a competitive funding award in order to be eligible for high E funds. And eligibility of high E funds means not just that competitive award, but meeting the performance requirements of that source as detailed in Appendix B. The notification process, everybody's favorite section. After you have done all that work through the month of October, you submit your application, you get your confirmation email from CAMS. What happens next? The Office of the Governor of Virginia does make that program funding award announcement public. That's typically done through a press release. That comes through an email blast. It's on the news or news release, press release tab of the governor's website. After the Affordable and Special Needs Housing Program application closes, we cannot answer any inquiries about the timing or the contents of this announcement. We will not be returning these inquiries. It is essentially a black box. If I could make awards the next day, I absolutely would. It is not the structure of the program, however. Generally speaking, the timeline is this. You'll submit your application by October 31st. The month of November, we are bananas over here because we have the Governor's Housing Conference, we have Thanksgiving, we have scoring all of your lovely applications. DHCD makes recommendations that goes through both the Secretary of Commerce and Trade and the Governor's Chief of Staff office as well. Once we make recommendations, we don't know anything until the governor makes his announcement. So we cannot provide additional context or information around that. We hope that that will be within about 6 to 8 weeks after the close of the application. However, this governor's administration is still in their first year, which means that there's still a learning curve. There's a lot of programs that fund projects that are announced through the governor's office. And many of those have additional funding, which means the recommendations packet that we create for them is longer than normal, or longer maybe than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And so there's a lot more information for them to review. I think as we proceed forward, that timeline will get a little bit more predictable, but they're still in their first year. It'll only be the second time that they've seen ASNH recommendations. And so it may take a little bit of time. Also, unfortunately, the timing of this process does fall over Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. And so full staff in office is not necessarily a thing that you can bank on. I will just say one thing, which is at the Governor's Housing Conference, we don't know. So any inquiries will not be returned. That's email, that's phone call, that is cornering one of us at the happy hour with a glass of wine at the Governor's Housing Conference. We hope to see everyone there. It's a great time. I'm excited about some of the panels that are coming through. we can't answer affordable and special needs housing application questions at that time. After the governor's public announcement of the awards, DHCD staff will send an email. That email goes to the project primary contact as listed for each project in CAMS. Please ensure that that CAMS project primary contact is the individual who should receive notifications about that project. These come out only through email and only to that primary contact. That notification will be either documents relevant to awarded funds or a denial of funding. If funding is denied, generally speaking, we will be able to review the score sheet and the project application with you. We're working out process and timing for that as time moves forward. And to an extent, the availability of a debrief and what that structure looks like will depend on the number of applications that come through. In our spring 2022 cycle, we had 63 applications. There are only currently 3 program administrators. And so if projects are not awarded, that's a considerable allocation of time and staff resources if we have one-on-one meetings. So more to come on the structure of what a debrief might look like. But certainly we will be providing technical assistance to any unfunded project to ensure a more successful application in future cycles. That notification of funding, should a project be successful, will come in a few parts. The first is a letter signed by our Senior Deputy Director, Sandra Powell. It notes the source, the amount of funding, and the project name. So to some extent, underwriting construction closes will work on those award letters. An additional document comes with those called the terms letter. And what those terms letters are is for each awarded source, it has the amount of funding, some project specific information, the interest rate and additional terms of the awarded funds. And that terms letter will also detail the information that is required by your program administrator to be able to move forward into a program agreement. So once you receive that terms letter, you can take it to underwriting if that's necessary, execute that terms letter and return it to your program administrator, and they will be able to walk you through all of the stipulations that are required for proceeding to a program agreement. From the date on that terms letter or the date of notification of funding, you have 12 months to proceed to an executed program agreement. That 12 months is a time frame that is given to applicants by DHCD for 2 purposes. The first is that for capital stack underwriting, we know that there are many layers of document and subsidy layering review that you have to go through. And so we want to accommodate all participants financially in the project with evaluating the source that is awarded and the terms of that award. The second is that prior to being able to execute a program agreement, each of those per source stipulations have to be met. So for example, for a home award, getting a completed Part 58 EA template, being able to go through the environmental record review process. For projects that have local home funding as well, we have to coordinate with that local agency to ensure that both of us have completed environmental record review documents, publishing public notice, having the comment period that follows, having the HUD comment period that follows. All of those have to fit within that 12-month timeline. So from the date that an award is published, so for this past spring, something around the neighborhood of August the 1st, you then have 12 months to complete a fully executed program agreement. But we encourage folks to go sooner rather than later, because we don't generally offer extensions to executing a program agreement, which is your formal commitment of funding. And if there are issues that come up because someone has slow walked signing that agreement, we can't always accommodate that. We do our best, but from just a staff capacity and rolling application cycles standpoint, that can be really tricky to ensure that all of the stipulations, excuse me, that require DHCD work are done in that 12-month timeframe. Those program agreements, which is the formal commitment of funds, typically expire after 24 months. And what that means logistically is that within 24 months of signing a program agreement, we expect that the project will be fully complete and ready to either sell to a buyer in the case of home buyer projects and have been issued a CO, or in the case of rental projects, have a certificate of substantial completion or have completed lease up and be ready to proceed into the perm conversion or closing process. We can sometimes offer extensions to that 24-month timeframe, but those are done on a case-by-case basis and only with particular consultation and approval by DHCD in writing. That is something that we can always talk through. If you have a project and me laying these out makes you a little bit nervous because you're looking at your email and noticing that you got something from Nakia or Carly a few months ago and you haven't replied, just let us know, keep us in the loop. The general idea here is that in order for DHCD to meet those per source requirements for commitment of funding and expenditure of funding, these are the timelines that keep us in line with both the state guidelines and also HUD guidelines. If there are any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to us about current or previous projects. And that brings us to the very end. So updated affordable and special needs housing program documents will be uploaded to the DHCD website. That includes these slides with the speaker notes, these slides with the recording of the speaking, all of our program guidelines and application instructions are already available in CAMS. We are working on getting all of the links updated on the website outside of CAMS to be reflective of the most current documents. I also just want to remind everyone that the 2022 Virginia Governor's Housing Conference is coming up in, I checked the website this morning, I think it's 42 or 43 days, so it's coming up rather quickly. We are really excited to be up in Northern Virginia for the first time in quite a number of years due to COVID interruptions. We will be at the Hyatt Regency in Crystal City. Registration is open through links on the DHCD website and the Virginia Governor's Housing Conference website as well. And then we will take just a brief break here. We will check in on the question and answer box or chat box, and then we will be answering those questions. All right, so if you will bear with us here, what I am going to do, because this recording will be published to the website, I will be reading what is listed in the chat. To some extent, these may have already been answered in the chat by staff, but this way everything is published and recordable. So Mitch asks, where are updated app instructions and program guidelines? Those are in CAMS with the applications that they are associated with. We are working on reviewing all of the links on the DHCD ASNH website, and we'll get those documents uploaded and links corrected this week. Lee asked, can developments that received high E awards in the past apply for additional funds if you are below the cap? So this information is very important. If your project has received a high E award and it is below the cap, you have two options. If all that you need is additional high E funding. You can come in through the supplemental application. If your project has received a high E award that's tied to a competitive source award, but the project needs additional competitive funding. So for example, you applied for $500,000 of Virginia Housing Trust Fund, you now need an additional $500,000 of home, then that would need to go through the fall 2022 competitive application process. And you can apply for both the additional competitive source funding that the project requires and the additional allowable high E funds through that same application process for the project. So on the budget tab, you just have multiple selections there. Chelsea asked the total funding available for supplemental high E for fiscal year 2023, which includes the typical fall 2022 and spring 2023 funding cycles, application cycles, and the supplemental high E round. That total available funds from that source is $80 million. Generally speaking, we have earmarked approximately $20 million for that supplemental round. However, much like other sources being able to be rolled forward, if we have applications that are below that amount, we will roll forward the high E allocation through additional funding opportunities this fiscal year. And if we have applications that exceed that $20 million that are eligible projects and under the high E total request cap of $2 million or 10% of the total construction costs, then we do reserve the right to allocate additional high E funds into that supplemental funding round. The intent there is to be relatively flexible with projects that do not need an additional competitive source. But until the application closes on October the 14th, the tentative awarded amount will be $20 million through that round. A local government, the question is, can a local government be eligible for ASNH funding, assuming it meets all of the eligibility requirements? No, because one of the eligibility requirements is that it is an eligible nonprofit organization, for-profit housing developer, CHOTO, or public housing authority. However, a local government can partner with a local, their own local housing authority or an additional CHOTO or another eligible applicant to establish a project site for development. For high E, are there any specific requirements required for high-rise multifamily buildings? Is there any possibility to apply for high E under a different certification standard if the building is a high-rise and does not qualify for zero energy ready homes? Currently, the structure of the high E program is that for new construction, a building must meet zero energy ready homes. I do understand that the organization that determines zero energy ready homes certification standards is working on a high rise, which for those of you who don't know the construction lingo, I believe that is 6 or 7 stories or above. They are working on refining what that requirement would be. But as of right now, a new construction building that exceeds the allowable height or stories requirement of zero energy ready homes is not currently eligible. If you have a particular building in mind or questions around ways that you sort of meet the standard, but not quite all the way to the certification, if you would reach out to me directly, and we will continue to have internal conversations and conversations with the stakeholder, the high E stakeholder committee, about how best to accommodate the breadth of buildings that are funded through ASNH. I know particular to the Northern Virginia market, it can be very difficult to make a project financially feasible if it's like 4 stories or below. And so that is something we are aware of, but unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you right now. For high E funding, will this be structured as a loan with a 0% interest rate? Can we ensure the funds are provided by a loan instead of a grant to avoid loss of LIHTC? The structure is, or the documentation is identical for high E funding. So if you have received a Virginia Housing Trust Fund award in the past, the program agreement and loan commitment are nearly identical. The one change is the funding source name. Some of the eligibility requirements that are listed in that document, and then the interest rate is given at 0%. So we have not gone through permanent conversion yet of many high E projects, but we have a number of projects that have received a high E award that have not seen a loss of eligible basis or credits, hasn't affected their underwriting or syndication. So if you have a particular underwriter or syndicator that has questions, I'm happy to set up a phone call with myself or someone on the high E team to talk them through that. Great. I did not realize that Dan Farrell was able to join us today. He is the Associate Director of Energy Efficiency, and he had a much better zero energy ready homes answer for me. And that is apparently from my own guidelines, which I have been swimming in, but have not fully internalized all the phrases of. Zero energy ready homes does not currently cover multifamily buildings above 5 stories, but will in an upcoming program update. In the meantime, program participants should design and build any projects above 5 stories in full compliance with the Department of Energy's Zero Energy Ready Homes program requirement, including third-party verification and completion of the applicable checklists. I would say if you have a high-rise building, I would still recommend that you reach out to an ASNH program administrator and just ensure that we are on board and know which documentation you're sending in to be in compliance with those requirements. Sunshine asks if a project has received previous high E funding but meets the supplementary guidelines, specifically being under the $2 million cap, can it apply for supplementary funds if it is already under construction or will be under construction when award decisions are made? High E is a state source, which means that we do not have the requirement for the federal sources, which is an environmental review and HUD site approval, prior to construction going underway. If you have a project that is under construction or will be under construction before, for example, the end of the year, I would just shoot us an email, Sunshine, and let us know sort of what you're thinking with regard to that project. Generally speaking, if a project can demonstrate that it meets those requirements, meaning the high E design build requirements, then if there's cap available, we can award it. There are, some particularities to a project that's already under construction, including on the developer side, underwriting changes and things of that nature that we would want to be in the loop for. And so if you have a project that is under construction but would be eligible for additional high E funding awards, just reach out to us and we can talk through that particular project setup. Kathleen Kramer asks, what preliminary documentation is needed for the green build certification? That documentation is the preliminary certification from the third-party certifier. So, for example, if you are doing Earthcraft Gold or higher, then that preliminary review typically from Veridiant, that would detail the ways in which your building is achieving the green build requirements, and sort of that original sign off is what is required. Sharon asks, for a project to be eligible for high-E funds, including in the fall round, not just the supplemental round, a project must have been awarded funds in a competitive ASNH category. This is a little bit tricky. For the supplemental round, because we are only awarding high-E out of that round, the project has to have achieved in spring 22 or previous rounds a competitive award. For the fall 2022 application, the project does not already need to have a competitive award. So if you have a brand new construction apartment complex, you are coming in for the first time in fall 2022, you are applying for Virginia Housing Trust Fund, and also you would like the additional funding available through high-E, you can achieve that competitive scored award and the high-E award in a simultaneous round. It is only for the supplemental round, because we are not awarding competitive funds through that process, that the project has to have previously achieved an award. Otherwise, you can come in a concurrent round and request 1 to 5 of the available sources and be awarded through a single competitive round. Charles asks or says, it's stated that there are no partial construction loan outlays. Is this correct? If one had the entire amount available, perhaps it would not need ASNH funds. For ASNH funds for rental multifamily projects, the funding from competitive sources and from high-E comes in the form of a loan, a permanent conversion loan. So that means that the funding is made available at the end of the construction process when conversion to all permanent financing sources is complete. For home buyer projects and for certain pre-approved group home or small construction permanent supportive housing only projects, it is possible to have construction remittances done on a reimbursement basis. If that is not a home buyer project, but rather falls into the process detailed in the program guidelines, which is a small development permanent supportive housing only or group home project, that requires a consult prior to application with DHCD to determine the availability and remittance schedule for those funds. Robbie asks what the UFAS Section 504 requirements are for single-family projects. In all honesty, I would have to pull up the regulations to look at that. If you have a project in mind, Robbie, shoot me an email and we can schedule a time to talk through the development guidelines for that. Jason asks, is there a cap on funds from the government but other programs? Yes is the answer. This is included in our program guidelines. Both Home and National Housing Trust Fund have to go through what is called a subsidy layering review, and they have maximum funding amounts per unit established through the Home Final Rule. Those dollar figures per unit are on a assisted unit bedroom count basis, and they are updated annually. The most updated figures for maximum amount of funding that a project or unit is eligible for is in our program guidelines. And if you have a certain project in mind that already has a commitment of government funds from other sources, please reach out to us and we can set up a technical assistance call to talk through what the maximum allowable amount would be, because that does depend on source that is currently allocated to the project. David asks what percentage of the project needs to be at or below 30% AMI in order to qualify for National Housing Trust Fund. The minimum number of units is 5, and that is for a per source basis for rental projects, David. So if you look at our program guidelines, there's a couple of examples that we sort of talk through building makeup and unit mix. But generally speaking, if a project has National Housing Trust Fund, that's 5 units at or below 30% AMI. If a project has National Housing Trust Fund and home, this is particular to those federal sources, then the minimum would be 10 units, 5 at 30% AMI, 5 at or below 60% AMI, structured according to the home guidelines. The actual unit mix and number of assisted units is determined through underwriting and has to do with the amount of funds requested, the total number of units, and total development costs of the project. It's required through federal regulations to be proportional. And so if you have a particular project with unit mix predetermined, feel free to reach out to us and we can talk through what might be required of the project. But until we get through award and underwriting, those final determinations haven't been made. Generally speaking, an application should be submitted with a minimum of 5 units that are already in the underwriting at 30% AMI or below in order for us to qualify you for a National Housing Trust Fund award. When would we hear about an award from the High East Supplemental round due on October 14th? That is a great question, and I do not yet know the answer to it. I do know that we will be following the same process with regard to making recommendations to the Secretary of Commerce and Trade and the Governor's Office. However, I am not imagining that we will need to go through the full announcement process, which buys us some time in that the announcement process, you are vying with other PR statements made by the governor's office, right? So there's only a limited number of hours that you can release statements in a day. And so sometimes, for instance, if you have a hurricane hitting over the weekend, just an example, and there's additional announcements around a state of emergency, et cetera, funding announcements can and do get bumped for things like that. So I don't anticipate that we will need to wait for a governor's announcement because we are not awarding any new projects that have not previously been announced. But I don't yet know a firm timeline on when an announcement or when email alerts would come out from that supplemental round. Robbie asks, is there scoring preference for larger projects or projects with more units? As of right now, there is not a scoring preference. What I can say is that in the need category, DHCD's panel is evaluating sort of the project as a whole and also the case that the applicant makes for the project and the structure of the project meeting the needs of the market area, demonstrated through a market study or any additional information that is announced, any additional information that is provided through the application process. Tyrone asks, we are a nonprofit considering purchasing an old motel and converting it into PSH. Which program will best fit our needs? For that question, because it is so particular to a project and not a generalized question about the program, I would advise that you email one of the program administrators. That's in all of our contact information is in the program guidelines, and set up a technical assistance call, because that will take a little bit more time and detail than could be provided through this. Charles asks, are there funds available for refinancing just purchased properties that are being converted into PSH units? Our funding is not available for acquisition or refinancing only projects. The project has to be construction or substantial rehabilitation of housing units. So Charles, if that project is purchasing a property and then also performing those substantial renovations that meet the minimum $15,000 per unit spend, as well as 3 of 5 or more matrix systems, then it is possible for funding to be applied to that project. But if you have a particular project in mind, I would recommend, again, contacting us for technical assistance. Austin says, does the Virginia Housing Trust Fund require Part 58 and or subsidy layering review? State sources do not require environmental provisions to be followed. Those are specific to the source. Home is under Part 58. National Housing Trust Fund is, I believe, under Part 92. Those are federally specified environmental review processes. If a project is only applying for state sources, we do require a phase 1 contamination report or phase 1 report be submitted, performed and then submitted as part of due diligence on our projects, but we do not require the full Part 58, the following environmental processes, or a subsidy layering review. However, if you are utilizing federal sources from other governmental organizations, including project-based vouchers, for example, then you may need to go through subsidy layering review, or SLR, with that agency. Eric says we have projects that are jointly developed, often called 9-4 twinned projects. We would assume that for the supplemental round, either specific deal of the 9-4 must have previously secured an award of ASNH. Yes. For the purposes of affordable and special needs housing, each project that is under its own financial entity is considered an independent project, which means a 9% deal and a 4% deal, while twinned, are independently financially managed and syndicated. And so each of those projects has to apply for its own affordable and special needs housing competitive award and provide its own documentation that construction meets the high E performance standards, particularly in Northern Virginia, where Eric does quite a bit of work. Sometimes those 9-4 twin deals are financially independent, but housed in the same building, which can make documentation a bit tricky. Eric, if you have any projects that you are working with the developers of, have the developer reach out to me. We are happy to talk through any particularities around those developments and make sure that they got all their ducks in a row. Ethan says, new construction high rises are currently ineligible. I was wrong. I apologize for that. Our acquisition rehab projects and high rise is eligible. Ethan, if you have a particular project in mind, what I would recommend is reaching out to myself. We can set up a call with either Aaron Shoemaker, who is a program administrator under energy efficiency, the high E funds, or Dan Farrell, who's this associate director of energy efficiency at DHCD, and we can talk through particulars of the project because clearly I spoke out of turn earlier today. So happy to talk through each of the requirements as indicated in Appendix B and how that would work for your project. All right, that brings us to the end of our question and answer session. I don't see any additional questions coming through the chat. Again, if you have any questions around this program or other funding that's available at DHCD, our program is specific to construction or rehabilitation of affordable housing, but there are a number of programs that are around service provision and so forth within buildings like this. If you are at a locality and you're interested in working through the CDBG or community revitalization process at DHCD, please feel free to reach out to one of our staff members. Our contact information is on the website and also is included in the program guidelines that will be made available on the website shortly. We are happy to make any kind of connections. I know DHCD is we're a small agency, but we've got a wide breadth of programs. And so everything from rural broadband to Main Street to Go Virginia, economic development, All of those are housed under DHCD. So if there's any connections that we can make internal to the agency, we are happy to do so. Thank you so much for your time today. We are so happy to have so much money to be made available for housing development projects. And we look forward to seeing you at either a housing conference or in a little box on our screen on a technical assistance call. Thank you so much.